Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Across the Pond podcast with Lindsey Stroud, Director of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance Consumer Centre, and I, Martin Cullip, International Fellow of the Consumer Centre. And our guest today is Carissa Düring from Sweden, who many people might have seen. She's a passionate advocate for pouches and snus in Sweden. She's the director of Considerate Pouches, a global consumer advocacy group dedicated to promoting a smoke-free world and consumer rights to alternative nicotine products. She studies clinical psychology in Uppsala University in Sweden and has had a long political background in the Centre Party as a youth politician. But in recent years, she spent her time in non-partisan student organisations such as the Excellent Students for Liberty internationally and the Confederation of Swedish Conservative and Liberal Students in Sweden. So welcome, Carissa. Good to see
you. Good to see you guys too.
Now, to start off, I met you recently in Sweden, didn't I? I came over for Almedalen Week, which for people who don't know, is like a political festival, really, isn't it, on the island of Gotland?
Yeah.
Just about 40 minutes flight from Stockholm. I was quite struck by the different way you seem to do politics over there. It seemed very laid back. And do you want to tell us about the approach to politics in Sweden? Because you've got, what, 11 million people there? It seemed to be completely different from the very aggressive way that we do politics in the UK and the US.
Yeah, I think it's kind of something that we a bit take for granted, but this Almedalen Week is something that happens every year, and it's been going on for, I think, almost 50 years. And everybody can come there, like normal people, politicians, people who are in businesses or regions, and just meet and have a conversation. And it's a very nice tradition that we've been having for a long time. I think it's a very unique, and a lot of countries have been trying to take on the same way of doing things. It's very special because you kind of can find all these very high-end top politicians gathered in one place, just walking around on the street as just, normal people.
Yeah, and again, I spoke about it because I spoke at a panel there, and I spoke that all the time I was there. We hear about Sweden, a lot of people talk about Sweden, and I was telling the audience there that they may not realise how much we talk about Sweden in other countries. They seem quite surprised at that. But I did say during that all the time I was there, it's not a fable. I saw one person smoking, but I saw pouch cans and snus cans everywhere. Restaurants had people with something to eat and something to drink and a can of snus or pouches next to them. So it does work, and although we talk about it a lot, to actually see that in action and see how alternative products have taken over nicotine use in Sweden. So we witnessed the experience of Sweden and how they use pouches and snus rather than smoke. But do you want to tell us how that came about, and also this proportionate taxation scheme or system that Sweden now seems to be doing by reducing tax on snus, etc.?
Yeah, I must say too that this difference visually was one of the reasons why I understood that Sweden had something different, because when I went internationally, I saw that people were smoking everywhere, and then I came back home and I was like, this just doesn't exist here in the way it does in the rest of the world. So we've had snus for a very long time, and nicotine pouches are relatively new, but they've exploded in popularity, especially amongst young women. So most people have transitioned from smoking into nicotine pouches. And when it comes to the taxation of these products, we've been taxing them differently, basically as long as we've had them, not because of the idea of relative risk that they wanted this to be reflected, rather by chance. So snus has always been taxed lower than cigarettes, and the nicotine pouches has also been taxed lower than both snus and cigarettes, although they have been consistently increasing the tax on both snus and cigarettes for a very long time. Until this last year, 2023, the government, for the first time, stated that they wanted to reflect the differences in harm between the different products. So they lowered taxes on snus with 20%, and they increased it on cigarettes with 9%. So we've had this kind of relative taxation for a very long time, which of course has influenced the markets and consumer behaviors. But now they are increasing the difference even more and stating that this is the reason. We see that there is a difference in harm here.
Yeah,
I'm actually going to like chime into that, because the relative risk, I know in the States, we're like still trying to differentiate it with our different tobacco products, which is really unfortunate. What we've seen here is just more alarmism that we've got to tax these, you know, these products that are safer. So that's kind of cool that it came by on chance, but it's cool that you guys are seeing the relative risk on that. I know we're working at the state level to get some of the like heated tobacco products at a reduced risk or at a reduced tax, as well as well, we'll see what happens with pouches, but we'll talk more about that when we get to American alarmism.
Yeah.
Yeah, when it comes to pouches, you know, we've read worrying reports that the EU is going to start acting on nicotine pouches. Now, snus is banned across the whole of the EU, apart from Sweden, of course. But if they were to bring in a ban on nicotine pouches, presumably Sweden would be swept up in that, wouldn't they?
They would. We don't have an exemption for nicotine pouches. We only have an exemption for oral tobacco. And nicotine pouches doesn't contain tobacco, so we can lose that as well, which is this little detail in the legislation is kind of a problem when it comes to policy and advocacy, because most Swedes don't realize that they can lose nicotine pouches. Because for us, we don't see a big difference between snus and nicotine pouches. Really, we're just like, oh, it's kind of the same product. So we probably are the only ones who have that too. There's a lot of Swedes that don't even know that you can find nicotine pouches in the rest of the EU, except for a few countries who have banned it. So there's not so much pressure on our politicians, because the knowledge that we can lose nicotine pouches is in general very low.
So do you think Sweden will stand up to the EU if they start making moves toward nicotine pouches, especially considering a lot of them are made in Sweden? You know, Swedish Match are a big producer, aren't they?
This is I really hope so. But 6-8 months ago, I was a lot more worried, because there was no discussion about this in media, and these reports was leaked from the EU where they are looking to ban it, and nothing happened. But then in about March, February, one of our biggest newspaper released, or they did a reportage where they showed that the government today, they have just been passive in this question, and that the EU is actually trying to ban nicotine pouches, and it became huge news. And protecting nicotine pouches in the European Union became one of the most important questions in the European elections. So that's a great development, because then it is up on the agenda, and our politicians will probably protect it. But I think the big risk here is not is that it won't come up in our national media, and so it will just happen, and then the politicians will be like, oh, we didn't know, and then it's too late. So you kind of have to act beforehand, and the risk is that the Swedish politicians won't do that. But if they know that it's going to happen, and that the Swedish population, like the Swedish people, also know, then it will be, the politicians wouldn't have the people wouldn't have any confidence in the politicians if they pass a ban on nicotine pouches in Sweden. So politics is a lot more complicated than if it's especially in the EU. It has also a lot to do with whether the people know that it's happening or not.
I have a question, and I'm playing a devil's advocate here for some of our viewers who might be really confused about nicotine pouches, Swedish snus, and also smokeless tobacco. Can you kind of explain the difference between all of these products for some of our viewers who might not just be well aware of what is very different about any of them?
So what is very different about snus is that it is it's a tobacco product that has been produced in such a way that all of the usually associated harmful chemicals, like the nitrosamines, are significantly reduced. So it's a much safer product that you put under your lip and you keep it there. Usually it comes in a pouch. Snus traditionally didn't come in a pouch. It came like a loose powder, more similar of what you can see with other kinds of smokeless tobacco products or oral tobacco products. But since the 80s, they came in a pouch instead, which increased their popularity a lot. And nicotine pouches, they don't contain any tobacco at all. It's just nicotine, and the content of a nicotine pouch is very similar to the content of nicotine replacement therapy products. So that's the big difference between nicotine pouches and especially snus and other smokeless tobacco products.
Yeah, and they work in the same way basically as nicotine patches, don't they? They just let the nicotine into your bloodstream, but through your mouth rather than on your arm or something like that. Yeah.
Well, they work the same way as nicotine gum, and then it's through your mouth. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Really. But still, people treat it like it's something very different, but really, it's quite similar to products we already have and have accepted as lower risk and ways of stop smoking.
Yeah. I want to talk about something a bit different, because as we can see from your marvelous background, you're currently visiting Argentina, aren't you? You're over there to learn about Javier Milei with Rutger, who's your partner. You've been there for what, 2 or 3 weeks? How's it going? What have you been discovering?
We've been here since the 2nd of July, so it's quite a long time now. We spent our time meeting with all kinds of people, a lot of politicians, but a lot of ordinary people who have companies, big companies. We met the CEO of or the president of Scania, which is a Swedish company, but in all of Latin America, and spoke about how is it to be here and function here in Argentina. And the reason why we are so interested, of course, is that they've chosen the first libertarian president, or at least someone who says to be a libertarian president, which is very interesting because he is doing a lot of reforms in a country which is very it's a very complicated country with a lot of years of a state which is just growing and growing and growing and growing, leading them to a lot of fiscal deficits and tons of inflations and a lot of poverty as well. And so he has come into the people have chosen him as a kind of new alternative, and he is going to reform, or he's trying to reform, the Argentinian society in a more libertarian direction. What is very interesting about this, though, is it's very difficult because he doesn't have the support in the Congress that he needs to pass the bills that he wants to. He has still passed a lot of things, but he has to pass a lot more. And that's kind of because they choose their Congress and their president at different times. They have very many different elections. So a lot of it is kind of dependent on the next election, on whether he is going to get the support in Congress that he needs to make progress. So as a libertarian, this is very interesting, right? Because whatever happens now, whether he fails or succeeds, that will influence the discussion for many years to come. And therefore, we need to be really attentive to, okay, why, if it works, why did it work? Was it our ideas? Was it something that was very special with Argentina and their political situation? If it doesn't work, the same thing. Was it Argentina? Was it a country who was in too deep of a mess to be fixed? Or was it something that was wrong with our ideas? So we are kind of trying to understand the background so that we can see where this will go forward.
Yeah, I wrote an article about Milei and saying how harm reduction would be ideal for a libertarian president such as he is, but so of course vaping is banned in Argentina, and I'm not sure about other snus and pouches, but yeah, it'd be nice if he carries on. I remember, I think one of the images of that election when he was he was elected was him campaigning with a chainsaw, where
Yeah.
he was saying he was going to like just chop up whole sections of public sector and stuff, didn't he?
Mm. What's really amazing with him is that he has managed to, a lot of people say this, and I think it's really true, that he's one of the first presidents that can go out and say to people that I'm going to make it worse for you, and they still vote for him, because he is very good at explaining complicated economic terms, such as with the motor saw. He's like, we have to cut spending, but he also has this mantra, which is no hay plata, there is no money. And he just keeps repeating this and educating the public. And Argentinians in general are very well acquainted with national economic terms. Even our Uber driver can explain to us different, how inflation works, and how the central bank works, and etc., etc. In Sweden, every year we have to explain, the radio has to explain to the Swedish people that when inflation go down, doesn't mean that things get cheaper. It just means that they get expensive less fast.
Yeah.
So it's a very different kind of political culture here.
We need him to come to the United States, okay? I mean, our own Congress can't understand basic economic terms if you just look at our deficit, okay? $32 trillion and growing, so.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the United States, and I had to ask, okay, because yeah, you're seeing that we're having it's all Zen alarmism, but it's a lot. What I don't think a lot of people are realizing too is we're having a huge growth in nicotine pouches, not just even by just the Zen. You're seeing, you know, massive amount of brands coming out. Whether what they're playing by FDA regulations is to be determined on that. Do you have any advice for both consumers, you know, to be on the lookout for, and also like what they should be conveying to their politicians who might be a little bit reactionary and overly precautious? I know in the United States, actually, if you're looking at youth use of tobacco pouches in general, and that it's one of the studies that only looks at like smokeless, and they put it all together. So it's smokeless, snus, pouches. And then we've got ones that are, I think they put snus and pouches at the same ones, because we got both of them. But I think when they're monitoring the future is looking at them both the same. But you had the highest rate of youth usage of this in like 2012, when it was about like 5% of people using it. So that definitely would have been snus, because we didn't have that many pouches out here. But now it's down to like 1%. So clearly we're not, now with how everything goes, if you're having a lot more media attention, usually caused by politicians, you know, you're going to see an uptick. So any advice that you have for, you know, Americans who might be consumers, or even just the politicians who might want to be, you know, do something about something that really doesn't exist?
Yeah, I think a lot of this panic, a lot of this panic comes from the idea that the youth will start using it. And there are for sure some people that will start using nicotine pouches that have never smoked before. But that's also the point in some way, because now we have a generation that never started smoking in the first place. And it's easy to be reactionary. It's a lot harder to sit back and say, okay, but can we look at a country who has already done this, who has this in a good way with good regulations set in place, and look at like, how can we protect people from the damages rather than the actual consumption of nicotine, or just nicotine pouches as an idea, because that's usually the problem. That it is a big problem to have this idea of what nicotine pouches are, and it's not really in accordance to what they are actually. Like we said, it's very similar content to nicotine replacement therapy products. It's not really what people have in mind when they think about nicotine pouches. So I think what's very important here too is for adult consumers to go out and say that this is something for us too, so that the question is not only about the youth, because that's a discussion that's kind of super difficult, and it's kind of rallies up a lot of emotions. So it's more important to make it about the older consumers that can benefit so much from these products.
It's frustrating, isn't it, that what I see as a good thing is that, you know, I'm of an age when I remember before vapes existed, before pouches were around, and if someone who was young started using nicotine, they would be using cigarettes. There wasn't anything else to use, and yet here we are now. And I go to, I mention it all the time, I probably bore people. I go to sports events and you see people in their early 20s using vapes. Well, I don't know, they might be using pouches, but you wouldn't really see them, would you? But almost none of them smoke. And I see that as a good thing. And yet there seems to be this panic that they mustn't use nicotine at all. And you hear these people saying, oh, but now we're seeing people who are using vapes who've never smoked before. But what if they would have smoked if the vapes weren't around? No one seems to think of that counterfactual. So I think it's all a good thing. And there is a lot of panic about it, but it's hard to get that sense across to politicians who can only see the downside and are being misinformed a lot of the time. But yeah, my heart sings when I see young people vaping instead of smoking. What's wrong with that?
Actually, speaking of going back to Almadon, there was a panel that I was listening into about nicotine pouches, and I mean, we struggle with this as well in Sweden. There was a woman on this panel. She was like, oh, but we have a problem that there's a lot of people who have started using nicotine pouches and never was going to smoke before. And another person in the panel was like, well, they would smoke if they didn't have nicotine pouches. And she just said, oh, you don't know that. And I was like, well, you can kind of look at every other country in the world and look at what their youth is doing. It's not like the Swedish ones are magically different. They wouldn't pick up nicotine. No, we have the same amount of nicotine use as the European average. We're not that special. So of course they would smoke if they didn't have nicotine pouches. But it's really hard. Like, people don't understand it. I mean, and we struggle with it even in Sweden. So.
I like your comment about different lungs. I always sit there and say, when we always bring up Public Health England and vapes, and it's like, oh yeah, the UK people, they got different lungs, you know, and they can, when, you know, vape's not bad for them, it's just bad for us Yankees. It's just kind of amazing. And I know one of the statistics that I've, you know, I got started working on tobacco harm reduction in 2016 with Dr. Radu, and Radu was looking at Swedish snus like back in the 90s and really kind of advocating for it. And he's a dentist as well, you know, and is his specialty. But you know, that Swedish men had the highest rates of tobacco use in all of Europe, like in the 90s, but they also had the lowest incidences of smoking, like lung related and smoking related illnesses, which I just thought was like really amazing. It just kind of shows the efficacy of the product itself as far as being as a harm reduction product.
Yeah. I spoke with a Swedish doctor who he teaches at a university for med students, and he was like, it's amazing because all of these med students, they sit and they all have nicotine pouches, and a lot of doctors are as well. It's like, well, I have seen it with my own eyes that people who use snus, they don't get sick in the way that people who use cigarettes does. So they eventually become advocates because of that reason, which I think is a very, very strong, very strong.
Sure. Yeah, I just thanks for coming, Carissa. One last point I wanted to make is that I was quite surprised that, speaking to the people in Sweden, they didn't realize too much about how they were influencing people like us when we talk to the rest of the world, because for them it's just, you know, pouches and snus are just what they do. It's just part of everyday life. There's nothing unusual about it, nothing extraordinary. So it was quite interesting hearing from them that they seemed surprised that we were all talking about Sweden in such glowing terms around the world. They're completely unaware that was happening. So thanks very much for joining us all the way from Argentina, and hope to see you again in person soon at some event or other. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks from Lindsey and me and Carissa for this across the pond podcast, and we hope to see you next time next time we have one of these. If you have any suggestions who you think you'd like to see us talking to, do give us a shout, and we see you next time.
Thank you.